So you have visas, you're prepared to fly to Moscow. What do you think Lon's going to say to Edward when they meet?
We have visas. I will not disclose the particular dates to avoid a media frenzy. It's soon. And I have no doubt he'll say, I love you and I miss you and I want to know that everything we're doing is in your interest. I think Lon is very sensitive to the fact that his son is 30 years old and his son ultimately decides his fate. Lon doesn't sit there as a dictator and says, well, you need to do X, Y, Z. He's very respectful of his son's independence. His son will make up his own mind. And I think what Lon will reassure his son is our mission, so to speak, is to ensure that Edward has the full array of facts, legal options on the table that he fully apprehends before he makes any kind of decision, whether it regards representation in the United States or book deals or reading books or anything else. But ultimately, the decision is with Edward.
It seems to me that Edward Snowden basically came forward with this information because he wanted the people of the United States to have this conversation, whether or not this was lawful, whether or not it's appropriate for the United States to spy to the degree that they are at this stage. And yet it seems to me that the argument now is Edward Snowden a patriot or a traitor? Is it really occurring, or is the conversation a different conversation?
No, well, I think the conversation is occurring. I mean, the President of the United States has now, at least he's tasked James Clapper, who's the one who is the culprit of the whole secrecy, with establishing some kind of civil liberties review in the government with private input. I'm sure they're not going to ask me to see whether or not there could be greater protections built into the surveillance programs. And I know, because I've been up in Congress, they've had many hearings and legislation introduced to change the Patriot Act and the FISA amendments that were disclosed by Edward Snowden. So those actions of Congress show that he has succeeded in generating the public support, because Congress is acting since I think it's like 77% of Americans in the latest poll believe that the NSA needs greater restraints. Huge. That would 77% wouldn't have been there without Edward Snowden, because they wouldn't even known that the programs existed without these disclosures.
If you would, talk to me about Lon's evolution, because it seems to me initially he was willing to work with the government, and then gradually it seems like he's had this evolution and kind of a decidedly different opinion about the government now.
That's true. And of course, initially, and this was reflected in the letter I wrote to Attorney General Eric Holder, there was at least some plausibility that the government would be amenable to at least exploring the idea of a set of conditions that would ensure what I call a due process trial rather than a show trial. But subsequent actions of the government, I think, maybe disillusioned both of us. One example is the repeated refrain that you find from those ranging from Nancy Pelosi and Dianne Feinstein to Peter King to the former Vice President, John Boehner. Oh, Edward Snowden, he's guilty of treason. Without a trial, really? Oh, he's caused members of the United States to die. Really? Did you ever hear anything about a presumption of innocence? Ever hear anything about, hey, Mr. Snowden did what the President of the United States said he wanted to have done, namely provoke a national conversation over whether these surveillance programs of the NSA were justified, especially in light of the encroachment on the right to be left alone. And none of that. It's almost as though Edward Snowden has disappeared as a person at those echelons of political power, as though it was some unicorn that disclosed the NSA programs that created the constructive conversation which probably will culminate in some congressional action. But Ed Snowden, nowhere to be seen. One of the things, and this is really separate, that I'm already in the process of doing is drafting amendments to the Espionage Act, because it's really, I think, ill-considered legislation when it was enacted 100 years ago. I think it's been amended once to provide retroactively defenses. For example, the declarant, the communicant, had a reasonable belief that he was disclosing government wrongdoing or illegality, and also require the government to disclose, if they're going to get a conviction under the Espionage Act, that you were actually spying for a foreign government. It really is a misnomer as a statute, because Edward Snowden was not spying for Russia, he's not spying for China, he's not spying for a foreign country, the typical kind of spy which you think espionage applies to, right? You're Robert Hansen selling secrets to the Soviet Union, or Kim Philby doing something like that. But that obviously is not Ed Snowden. Ed Snowden is disclosing information to us, the American people, who have a right to it. Espionage? for disclosing to the American people what their government was doing to them? It seems very odd.
This is about policy, but it's also about politics, and it's also about people. So describe for me, I know that Lon Snowden really hasn't had normal conversation with his son, but there's been informal conversation. Has he wavered in any way? And how about Lon? How is he holding up?
Well, I don't know. There have been indirect communications with Edward, but since April, Lon has not been able to have direct communications, and he feels very strongly. This is one of the reasons why he's eager to go to Moscow to see his son face to face. That's a different chemistry than even communicating in muffled voices. But I think it's fair to say that Lon views his son with great admiration, questioning whether he would have done the same thing, because Lon was in a fair amount of intelligence in his work at the Coast Guard and otherwise. And so he was actually offered jobs with the Booz Hamilton types when he took his retirement. So he understands the pressures, and he understands the allurements of $200,000, $300,000, relatively easy work, in these huge subcontracts and contracts with the government to spy. But I certainly do not, I know that Lon has not wavered in his understanding. Listen, it's something that's painful. It's something that maybe he hadn't chosen in his retirement years. He was thinking he was well off and he could enjoy spending time with his family, and that's sort of been cast to the winds on that score. But I think overall he's glad, because even though he's engaged and it can become fatiguing and exhausting at times, he's also a true patriot and says, I've got to do it. Maybe it wasn't my voluntary choice, but there's no stepping back here. I've crossed the Rubicon. In some sense, he feels that he should have been engaged more as a citizen than he was. This was kind of a wake-up call for Lon. He wasn't like maybe you or me have been in it for 45 years, and that's unusual because that's not typically the circles that people deal with. But now he knows what the flaws in the system are, maybe less in detail than I do, but emotionally and psychologically says, this is America, the Fourth Amendment, and he understands that this issue is bigger than just Edward Snowden, and he's committed on both fronts.